Adding a walk cycle to an animated character opens up a ton of creative possibilities. Instead of your character just standing here in the scene and being kind of boring and not doing anything, you can have them walk off or on the stage. You can have them pace back and forth. You can have them walk and talk with other people. There's a ton of possibilities that it opens up. So in this tutorial, we'll talk about Character Animator's walk behavior, how to rig your character to identify all the different parts that the walk behavior is looking for, and how to customize the different settings down here to match the arm swing and speed and personality of your character to get exactly the right walk cycle for your creations. This example puppet Kaufman is available on the OK Samurai Puppets page for a free download. You're free to pick him apart, see exactly how he was made behind the scenes, and swap in your own artwork or use what you've learned here for your own creations. To set up your artwork to use the walk behavior in Character Animator, you're going to want to put your character in one of these two views, either a side profile view where they are facing directly side their body and their face from the camera, or a 3/4 view like we see here on the right where the shoulders and the hips are opened up a little bit more. Now the walk behavior will not work if you want a character who moves with a front facing walk or walking backwards or an overhead view or anything else. For a character like this, this is Wonder Boy taken from the Adobe Character Animator Examples official page. This is a cycle layers frame by frame animation that's baked into the character that is triggered when I hold down the W key. Now the walk behavior is looking for either one view or 3 views in your character. I'll show you what I mean. So here's a version of Kaufman that is only rigged for one view. And regardless of if he's standing or I'm holding right or I'm holding left, he's always in the same view. He's always facing the right side of the screen. And this is the simplest way to rig, and this is going to work for a lot of different cases, but you may not want your character, be moving backwards. And then also in the standing view, you can't fix the legs to the ground, and so you might get this kind of floaty feel that you don't want. The slightly more complicated way to do things is have a 3-viewed character. So this character now has a standing view, a right profile walk view, as well as a left profile walk view. So now you're going to get a character who you can specifically do things in the stand view, the left view, he flips around back to his stand view when I stop, and the right. Now the way this character is set up, his standing view and his right profile view are pretty much the same. The only difference is that the standing view is rigged with the feet stuck to the ground, and the right profile view is rigged to be have the legs moving. So we're going to build up to this more complicated 3-view version, but first we're going to start with the single view version. So here's the 1-view simple version, and if I look at the Photoshop file, it's basically the same structure we always say, plus character group with a head and body group inside it. The main thing I have to worry about when I'm thinking about the body is I want each limb, so each of the arms and each of the legs, to be its own independent part. So each leg, each arm, all of those needs to be in their own separate layer, and they each have a plus symbol in front of it. Don't worry about the naming conventions here. I just put R arm. It doesn't have to be specifically, left leg or something like that, because the limbs themselves are not what's being tagged. It's the individual parts like elbow and wrist and things like that that we'll tag later. And as usual, you want to think of your layer structure. So if you want the right arm showing up in front of the right leg or in front of the body, you need to make sure that that's where it's positioned. So as you're thinking about how your legs are going to go in front of each other, make sure that the layer order matches the order that you want things to be seen in your walk cycle. All right, so I just imported my PSD into Character Animator, and I'm going to do a few things to set Kaufman up for walking. The very first thing I'll do is make sure my top level is selected up here. This is the thing that gets all these automatically added behaviors when you first import a character. And I'm going to go over to the behavior section, click plus, and go to walk. This is going to add the walk behavior to the character and now gives him the ability to walk. Now there are a ton of options down here. I'll deal with those later when I can actually see how they're affecting his different walk parameters. The next thing I'll do is take my character's main origin, I'll move it all the way down to the feet, and I'll do the same thing for the top character group here and move that down to the feet. That just means this character's origin, where he's going to rotate and pivot from, is going to be in the feet instead of the middle of the body. And for this view in particular, when you're standing, if you have these origins up higher, your character is going to pivot and rotate from that middle section as opposed to the feet. This just looks slightly better, I think, if you move these origins down. Next, I'll move on to the head, and the only thing I really need to do there is I'm going to drag the head origin down to the neck because that's where I want it to pivot and move from. And while that's selected, I'm going to go over here to my body tag section. I'm going to select the neck here, and that's going to add a neck tag to this origin. So even though that's not, necessarily the neck part, this is what we recommend for the neck tag, because this is basically where the walk cycle is going to bob the head up and down. So the bottom of the head origin is the best place to do that. Again, if you don't like the picture here, you can always go to text-based tags if that feels a little bit easier to you. So with that being done, I'm going to move on to the body. Now, in a little bit, I'm going to add quite a few tags to the body, but for now, I'm going to focus on each individual limb. So let's start with the right arm. That's the first one that I've got. I'm going to move the origin up to the shoulder so it connects, and I'm going to add two handles. I'm going to select the handle tool down here, the little circle icon, and I'm going to add two, one for the elbow and one for the wrist. Now, I'm only going to tag the elbow, so in this case, the right elbow and the right wrist. I'm not going to tag the shoulder on the arm. Usually, if you have a static character, it's okay to tag the origin as a shoulder, but in the walk cycle case, in the walk behavior, that is going to cause the arms to fall off or legs to fall off. So for the shoulders and the hip tags, basically where the arms and legs are connecting to the body, you're going to want to do those on the actual body group itself. And we're going to do that in a little bit, but for now, the elbow and the wrist, that's all we need. And to give it a little more structure, I'm going to select the stick tool down here and just add a couple of sticks to give a little bit of rigidity to the bicep and forearm area. While I'm thinking about the arm, let's move to the left arm. This is kind of blocked by the view, but I can have a basic idea of the outline of the shape here. If you're not seeing this yellow outline and these green dots and all that, make sure that this tool right here, Show Mesh Outline and Auto Handles, is on. That will allow you to see this. And then I'm going to go to the elbow and tag that. I'm going to make another handle down here and tag that as the wrist, and I will add the sticks just like I did before. So let's move on to the leg. So I'll select my right leg, I'll drag the origin to where it connects to the rest of the body down here, and then I'm going to add 4 different handles using the handle tool again. The knee, the ankle, the heel, and the toe. And let's select and tag each of these. So that's my toe, that is my right heel, this one is my right ankle, and this one is my right knee. And for me, I'm going to add some sticks here just to give it a little more structure where I would expect those bones to be. Let's repeat the same process for the left leg. Drag the origin up to where it connects to the body, add 4 different handles for where the different parts would be. Let's do the sticks right now where I can still see everything a little bit easier. And we will tag these as the knee and the ankle and the left heel and the left toe. Now I'm going to select the body group up here, and I'm going to add 5 different handles to this. So remember I was talking earlier about the shoulders and the hips. So the nice thing is you can see these little green connection points for where the arms and legs are connected to, where the limbs are basically connected to the body. I'm going to use those as my guidelines for where I want to put these tags. So I put a new handle here. Let's call that right shoulder. Another handle here. We'll make that our left shoulder. This I'm going to call my left hip, and this one here, my right hip. And finally, right around the belly button or something like that, I'm going to put 1 extra handle, and I'm going to call that the waist. All right, so I realize that is a lot of steps, but the bottom line is I basically found a place to put each of these dots on my character. So each of these parts is now somewhere in my character rig, and I can check the status of this and make sure I have everything by selecting that top level puppet group up here. I'm going to twirl open walk. I'm going to look at my handles down here, and I'm going to make sure that I have a 1 next to each of these. Now, one last thing before I add this guy to a scene, I'm going to select all of the different limbs. I'm just holding down Command on the Mac, or that's Control on Windows. And I'm going to go to my attach style, and instead of weld, which is the default, I'm going to change that to hinge. This is personal preference, and I honestly might go back and change this for a few things, how they look, but in general, I feel like the walk behavior looks and works best when your limbs are hinged. All right, so that looks pretty good. So let's select our puppet here, click the Add to New Scene icon, and that's going to add him to a new scene. So let's make sure he is a little bit smaller here. I'm just in the transform behavior, and I'm going to move him up. All right, so there we go. My character is walking, and it looks pretty good. You know, there's some refinements I want to make sure. I think the arms are a little too far out. There's some, weirdness. This leg down here, it's very clear that it's pivoting. I might change that to a weld attached style instead. But overall, it's looking pretty good. Now you're noticing by default, my character is just kind of walking in place, staying in one position, and not moving around. This is because that's how things are set by default in the walk behavior. So I can see here that start has been set to immediately. If I change this instead to left and right arrow keys, now he's going to stand still unless I press the right arrow on the keyboard or the left arrow on the keyboard, and then he'll walk forwards or backwards. But he's still walking in place. If I actually wanted him to move towards the right or the left side of the screen, I would go down to body speed down here, which is by default changed to 0%, so he doesn't just walk off the screen by default, and I'm going to change that to 100 instead. And now when I press the right arrow, he's going to walk off the screen, and when I press left, he's going to come back on. But generally, when I'm trying to fine-tune a walk cycle, I really want him to be doing that walk in place, so I know I can see the thing looping over and over again. I don't have to worry about him going off and on the stage. So I'm just going to undo those last two ones and get him back to this position. Now, even seemingly minor changes to the placement of where these handles are can have a dramatic effect on how your character is walking. So for example, the waist, remember I said put that at the belly button, but look what happens if you drag it a little bit closer to the front of the character. So notice now how he's hunched over a little bit more. Putting the waist forward just kind of pushed everything and angled everything towards the front. Whereas if I went back and did the opposite, moved the waist towards the back, now he's kind of leaning back a little bit, his chest is a little bit more pronounced. So play around with these. The positioning of all of these different handles can have dramatic effects on your character, how they're leaning, how they're moving, kind of how confident they feel or how hunched over they are. So play around with the placement of them and see what works best for your character. All right, so let's take a tour of some of these parameters down here in the walk behavior to understand how we can tweak them to customize them to match our character. So keyboard input, this just means when you press the red record button, your left and right arrow key presses will also be included in this data. Don't worry about it, just leave it armed and you'll be fine. Next, we already talked about start immediately versus left and right arrows. For right now, I'm going to change to left and right arrows because that shows off this next feature, start and stop easing. Now by default, this is 0.2 seconds and it's really not clear what's going on, but let's change this to like 2 seconds instead. Now when I press the right arrow key, see how he slowly builds up into that walk, and when I let go, he slowly goes back, and there it goes, and then it snaps back to the standing mode. So this just gives you a little control over how the walk starts and eases in and ramps up and ramps down back to a stand. For style, we have 6 built-in styles that are kind of used as your starting points for how your character can react, and these are based off of hand-drawn frame-by-frame walk cycle animations. This wasn't just something we thought, hey, this looks good, or this was a computer algorithm or something like that. It was actually taken from frame-by-frame walk cycle hand-animated data, and that's how the handles are moving, and then we translate that to where your handle placement is for your character. So we've got walk here. I'm going to skip ahead to strut. That looks pretty good. Prance, if he's a little more confident, he's got a little more, swagger in his step. Now, some of these might require a little bit of retagging or moving things around in order for them to look okay. So, for example, slump, by default, you see how the head is kind of being pulled there? This one has so much head movement that, honestly, if I was doing it this way, I would go into head and untag the head here, so the head movement is completely controlled by the slump movement instead. And that way it looks like the head is a little bit better connected to the rest of the body. So it all depends on what you're going for. I think sneak is kind of the same way. Sneak, the head is going to kind of move with the character. So, sneak's actually a good example to show us the next two things, stride length and step speed. So, by default, this guy doesn't look like he's sneaking. He looks like he's kind of convulsing or something like that. Instead, if I turn step speed down, you'll see he's going a little bit slower, and this feels a little bit better, like he's tiptoeing into something. He's being a little bit more deliberate. And then I've also got stride length. So if I wanted his stride to be a little bit wider, I can do that. And if I wanted to go in a little bit, I can do that. And he's taking really tiny little steps that way on his tiptoes. Step phase is basically where the walk cycle is beginning. So as I change this dial, it kind of changes where that, initial first step is. This isn't really used that often personally. I haven't used it that often, but if you set the step speed to 0 here, look what step phase does. You can kind of turn this dial and basically change the, the direction and the speed of walking. So potentially you could hook this up to like a MIDI dial or something like that and have that control, the step speed, or find some way to use it. Pose emphasis is interesting. It allows you to kind of say, hold on this particular pose or a key pose for a little bit longer. So if I turn this up a lot higher, you'll see the character really, is very robotic in the way they walk. And that's one way to do the walk. And I can turn this down to make it a little bit less dramatic, but instead of at 0, it's kind of one smooth motion of the walk happening. Now if I move this up, it's going to be a little bit more deliberate. And I can change exactly where that key pose is if I change the pose emphasis phase. So by turning this dial, this is going to kind of change where that key pose is. Again, just tweaking these little parameters is going to adjust the, the walk cycle in small ways, but for any particular character, one way might look good and it might look horrible on another character. So experiment with these and see what looks good for your own creation. Body speed we talked about before. You really only want this if you have left and right arrow keys on, otherwise your character is going to walk off the screen, and if you make it a negative value, they'll come back. Moonwalk there, but there you go. Next up is shoulder sway, and I'm going to do this and hip sway at the same time down here. So look what happens if I change shoulder sway up a bunch and hip sway up a bunch. See how the shoulders are kind of moving back and forth a lot more, and same with the hips. Basically, it's looking at the left and right shoulder and hip tags and determining how much these should be moving back and forth, how much sway there is. Now, when you do it really high, it's not going to look that good, but if you bring it down a little bit, you can kind of rein it in, and it'll look pretty nice and give a little bit of dimension to your character. These next 3 values are ones that I will change together. Elbow bend, arm angle, and arm swing. Let's start at the bottom here with elbow bend. You can see how you can bend these in, completely unnatural ways or more up or down. If you want your character just to kind of be straight, you can do something like that, or you can bring them in or out a little bit more. Arm angle is going to determine where the arms are angled to begin with. So here, if you have a zombie character, for example, maybe you want them reaching out to reach for someone's brains, or you can have them more, down or back, or whatever you decide. And arm swing is going to depend how much those arms are going to swing back and forth. So you can really exaggerate that, or bring it in a lot more to make barely any swing whatsoever and just kind of keep them by the side. So all 3 of these work together because they're all dealing with the arm movements, and I will make little tweaks and adjust these to get it just right. Toe bend is a pretty subtle thing, but it's basically how the toe bends, if at all, coming off the ground. It's hard to see when I have the step speed up, so I'm going to bring this to be a little bit slower. And let's move the toe bend up to 100%. And watch the toe as it pushes off of the ground here, and you can see a little bit of a bend. And that's totally dependent on where that toe tag is. I actually removed the sticks out of the foot for this example because it's going to be too rigid and not get enough bend if you have a stick down there. So it's an option of basically how your character is connecting to the ground and pushing off of it. And the last parameter down here, strength, this just determines how strong the walk behavior is applied to the different handles. So the elbows, the wrists, the knees, all of that stuff. So at 100% by default, it looks as you would expect, but as I bring it down, notice how the elbows and the knees are bending less. There's a little bit less of a walking presence, and all the way down to 0 gets him back into a rest pose, basically a stop motion, and then I can ramp that back up to have him start walking again. So you might want to turn it down if you feel like this 100% walk is too strong. You want it to be a little more subtle. You can dip that down to 90 or 80 or something like that. You could also hook this up to a MIDI dial or something along those lines to ramp up or down the amount of walk that you have at any given time. All right, so let's say I wanted to record a performance of this guy walking in. So I should set immediately to left and right arrow keys. I will change body speed to 100%. I will change transform to be where I want him to start. So in this case, position X, I'm going to move it, slide it so he's off the screen. And then I'm going to hit record. And now he's going to walk in when I press the right arrow key and stop right there. And there's my recording. Now, one thing that sometimes trips people up is that walking is a simulation, kind of like the physics behavior when you have, balls and things colliding with each other. That's not something that's baked in as a frame-by-frame thing that we see in the timeline. It's something that is kind of simulated on the fly. So if I am here at the 0, 0 position where I started my animation, everything's going to be okay because I can scrub through here and I'll see exactly how everything recorded as I would expect. The problem is, though, if I start to scrub back and, do this sort of thing, I'll notice my character even walks off the screen and is not starting in the right position, right? So right now I'm at 0, and this is where I started things off, but my character's here instead. And that's because as I was scrubbing around, I was kind of starting and stopping where the simulation was. So the bottom line is, if you want to see the true value of how your walk cycle is working, make sure you are at the start of where you recorded it. Hit the refresh scene button to make sure it's kind of zeroed back into that place. And now, as I scrub through, I can see that simulation take place and work exactly as I would expect. All right, so let's take what we learned so far with the walk behavior and now apply it to the 3-viewed, slightly more complex version. So the difference here is that I still have my plus main character folder, but instead of the head and body going inside, I have 3 different views. Plus frontal, which looks like that. Plus right profile, which looks basically the same, but there's some differences inside, and plus left profile, which is facing the other way. Let's check out plus frontal first. This is the view that's going to show up when the character is standing still. And basically this is the same as before. The only difference is in the body, I took the plus off of the right leg and left leg because I don't need those to be moving. He's actually standing, so I can keep those stationary and just part of the overall character mesh. So I removed the pluses from those instances. But now the right profile does add those back in. I have added the pluses. So the right profile is essentially my whole simple view. It's basically the exact same rigging that I had there. And then for the left profile, I just basically flipped the right profile around. So I just used the artwork I already had. So let's say I did this. I'm going to hold down Option on Mac or Alt on PC. I'm going to make sure this is inside the group and not outside of this main group. I'm going to drag that right under until I get that blue line. That looks good. Call this plus left profile. And I'm going to press Command T on Mac. That's Control T on Windows. And I'm just going to flip this guy around while holding down the Option key on Mac or Alt on Windows. And that's going to give me exactly what I did with the left profile view. So the basics behind this character are the same. It just means I'm going to have to rig everything multiple times to get it working correctly. So you'll notice when I click frontal here, the frontal view has been tagged over here in the tags area, and same with right profile and left profile. I want to make sure those things are tagged correctly in order for all of my views to show up. Next, in the frontal view, I'm going to want to make sure that the body, I've had some sort of fixed handle or tag down here. So in this case, I just took the stick, I dragged it here, and I tagged that as fixed to make sure when he's standing, his feet are fixed on the ground. And then it's the same idea that we rigged before with each of these profile views. So as I get into the body, you'll see I tagged everything exactly the same way with the legs and the arms and all of that stuff exactly as we showed before. The only difference is I had to do it twice because now I've also got the left profile view. And so in this case, I basically had to do everything a second time. Overall, this took me about 5 minutes to rig up this character, so not too long in the grand scheme of things, but it's a little extra work if you want these, additional views for your character. Now, before you go to add this guy into a scene, make sure that frontal is visible, because if your stand view, that frontal view isn't, you're not going to see anything. You're like, where'd my character go? And then when I press right, he appears and disappears, and left, he appears and disappears. So if frontal isn't showing by default, it's just going to not show up. So let's go in and change that, make sure that's visible, go back to record mode, and now he's showing up and his feet are planted on the ground as I would expect, and I can drag the arms and also press right to make him move right, back to his stand position, left to have him go left, and flip back to that standing position as well. Now, because these walking characters can have so much artwork behind them, you're basically duplicating, the head and body 3 times if you're doing something like this. That can lead to potential performance issues if you keep building on this character and animate a lot of extra stuff. Head turns, cycle layers, replays, all this stuff coming together. So what I would recommend is think about having multiple versions of your puppet. So maybe there's one puppet that works as a stationary version and don't add the walk behavior to them, and you can kind of have a lot of rigging specifically towards that. So I recently did this project, Evan Flamethrower Robot Detective, and that's exactly what I did in there. I had stationary and walking versions of each character, and I would animate them in Character Animator, dynamic link them into After Effects, and use each one whenever I needed it for whatever particular scene was at that time. So that's a basic foundation of how to set up the walk behavior. Over the past year, we've done a few videos of some particular tips and tricks to kind of optimize the walk behavior for certain types of characters or scenes, whether that's a character without any arms or legs, whether that's a character with head turns and how to manipulate all the different views that are changing there. And then also a hack kind of that does where you add the walk behavior to foreground and background elements to make it feel like your character is walking through a scene. All of those videos are listed in the video description below, so if those types of topics interest you, you should check them out for further information. Other than that, if you're creating a walking character, we would love to see what you've created, so please use #CharacterAnimator on social media for us to check those out. And if you're running into any trouble with setting up your walk cycle and you want more help or specific feedback on how you can improve it, the best place to get help is the official Character Animator forums. That's it for today. Thank you very much for watching, and have fun.